Okay.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Shared Spaces Future webinar, hosted by the Office of Economic and Workforce Development and produced by the virtual outreach team of the COVID Command Center. Just some housekeeping. Today's event is being recorded and is being streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. We respect all participants in this convening today and want to create a safe space for all. By default, all participants will be muted and video will be disabled, with video on for speakers only. If you'd like to participate in the Q&A section, please select the chat button at the bottom of your screen and send your question to Q&A Maria de Alva. And I'll turn this slide over to Dylan to speak about SF's release grants.
Okay, Dylan, you should be able to. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. The city has made available financial resources to small businesses who can prove that they have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Most recently, the community anchor grants and the storefront equity grants are available. For more information on those and other programs, resources and information applicable to small businesses and workers, please go to oewd.org/COVID-19. There you can find all of the available resources currently active for businesses, in addition to information for our small business and worker relief hotlines, where you can get personalized assistance and direct help. Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Dylan. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin Abad-Akabillo, the city's coordinator of the Shared Spaces program. Just want to start off by thanking the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, as well as the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, for organizing all the activities this week to get information out to small businesses in San Francisco. I'm joined today by Deputy Program Managers Monica Munowich at the SFMTA, Gregory Slocum at the Department of Public Works, and Maria de Alva, who is here with me at the Planning Department, or virtually with us at the Planning Department. Also joining us is the Director of the Mayor's Office of Disability, Director Nicole Bond, and Amanda Freed with the Treasurer and Tax Collector. So we've got a lot of brains here with a lot of expertise to help explain what the future will hold, as well as answer any questions that will come up during the session. So we'll start with a few slides, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And production team, are you all able to see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for the confirmation. So the team assembled here today is going to provide some information about a few things. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about where shared spaces are today, how the program's doing. We'll also talk a little bit about the policy goals and legislation that has been introduced at the Board of Supervisors, and for which companion legislation was actually just adopted at the MTA board earlier this week. Monica Munowich at the SFMTA is going to talk a little bit about site feasibility and curb management considerations. Gregory Slocum at the Department of Public Works will talk about site design, some specifics that are really important for us to keep in mind to have a safe and accessible shared space. And Director Nicole Bond at the Mayor's Office of Disability will talk about some of those design requirements that are specific to ADA. After that, Maria de Alva will facilitate a question and answer session. So as Nick said, please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A so that Maria can bring them up with us as a team at the end of the presentation. So to recap, shared spaces take place in all kinds of outdoor spaces in San Francisco, on our streets and sidewalks, as well as on open or vacant lots. So folks might be familiar with some of the street closures, the roadway closures that happen on Valencia, Grant Street, 37th Avenue in the Sunset. Where else? We've got 18th Street in the Castro, roadway closures all over the city. Parklets are also a really kind of visible part of the program. Those facilities that are in that parking lane. There are also shared spaces on the sidewalk, like sidewalk tables and chairs for sidewalk dining, and then community-sponsored ones in open lots. Shared spaces are also, aside from showing up in all those different places, they're also used in a variety of ways, focused on helping us get through this economic crisis that we're all in, the repercussions of which we know are going to last for the coming years. Outdoor retail and outdoor dining are some of the most prevalent or visible ways that shared spaces are used by small businesses throughout San Francisco. Personal services like haircuts or even adult fitness have also happened outside in parklets. Physically distanced queuing outside essential businesses like grocery stores or pharmacies is also a type of shared space, as well as curbside pickup. This is reserving basically parts of the curb in order to pull up in one's car to do contactless pickup of things like medications and groceries, other essential goods. There's also, as long as the public health parameters allow it to occur safely, entertainment as accessory to these other types of commercial uses. So I don't need to really get into the details about the economic crisis because we're all feeling it in one way or another. This is a slide with some statistics from late last year and really kind of emblematizes the environment that shared spaces was created in. Here you can see that San Francisco ranks about third in the nation in terms of small business closure, at least as of this date in late 2020, and fourth in the nation for business closures, for permanent business closures. So these trends are gonna persist over the rest of the calendar year and future calendar years. And that's where the future of shared spaces can help stabilize our small businesses. It's been a really dynamic year for everyone, especially our small business community. And we just like to take a moment to observe that it's been really dynamic. Public health protocols have changed. Design guidelines for shared spaces have also changed multiple times since we launched in July 2020. And what we're really hoping to do by legislating shared spaces and codify it is to stabilize a lot of those expectations around design, operations, public input, and all the other components of a program. There's been a lot of steady growth since we launched in July. You can see that there was a big sort of crest of interest, and we are seeing a leveling off of applications in San Francisco, kind of hovering around sort of 70% of 32,000 total applications. Applications do range across all of those different place types that I talked about earlier. Of course, most of them are kind of in that parking lane part of our public right of way. But here you can see that there is a good variety of where merchants like yourselves have been operating shared spaces. We talked about entertainment and the Just Add Music permit. When public health protocols have allowed, this has been a really incredible, vital layer adding to the kind of civic and social well-being that are the outcomes of the shared spaces program. So a really great example here on 24th Street in the Mission at the Lilac Lot. Folks have been also asking who shared spaces owners are. Who are you folks? In an ongoing survey, which we know many of you have taken at sf.gov/shared-spaces-impact, we've learned that 50%, actually a little bit more than 50% of shared spaces operators are actually women-owned enterprises. And that another third of shared spaces, small businesses, are immigrant-owned businesses. Over a third of shared spaces operators also identify as minority-owned in some way. That same survey is telling us that the program has achieved what it initially set out to do, which was to help you avoid permanent closure. And the numbers that we collect month over month, the surveys that we administer quarter after quarter, definitely reinforce that. So I think we are as a city and as a community hitting that foremost goal of the program. Pivoting a little bit to the future, and then I'm going to hand it off shortly to my colleague Monica Munowicz at the MTA. We have learned that folks do see this program and its continued existence as vital to continued economic stability and prosperity. So even after capacity returns is fully restored indoors, we know that helping to provide increased capacity is going to be vital for recouping losses, financial losses from the prior year or years. Okay, so the future. Everyone's told us, or many people have told us, that shared spaces will continue to be vital for our economic recovery. For this reason, the Board of Supervisors passed in November and then in March this last year, 2 separate resolutions urging that shared spaces be made permanent. So the city has taken this direction and the directive of Mayor Breed to heart, and we've started to work on legislation that will do just that. The legislation that was introduced by Mayor Breed with co-sponsors, supervisors Raphael Mandelman, Asha Safai, Catherine Stephanie, and Matt Haney are organized around these 9 goals. We don't have enough time today to talk about each and every one, but Monica, Greg, and Nicole are going to focus on some of these. And if folks have questions about other components during the Q&A, we can definitely answer them. One big piece of feedback that we've gotten since the mayor first introduced her legislation in March of this year was that the fee structure that was proposed didn't take into account equity measures, and that the fee structure was kind of a one-size-fit-all idea that actually wouldn't work for San Francisco, because there are businesses of different types that come, are obviously embedded in different communities that have sort of different histories around disenfranchisement, affluence, what have you. So for this reason, the most recent version of the legislation does a couple really important things, taking kind of equity and access considerations to heart. The first is that there is now a half fee waiver for all fees associated with curbside shared spaces for businesses that have SF gross receipts at $2 million or less. So rather than having to pay the full fee, which Monica will talk a little bit about later when she talks about curbside shared spaces or parklets, if in the most recent tax record that the city has on file for you, we see that you've grossed 2 million or less, you would qualify for a half fee waiver. As business performance improves and everyone gets back on their feet and folks start doing better, then of course, folks might phase out of that half fee waiver. Another really important equity measure is the fact that annual license fees are actually going to be waived from the present all the way through the end of 2023. Permit fees, your kind of first time, one-time permit fee will still be something that's collected. That won't happen until March 2022 as part of the Unified License Bill. But those annual license fees for everyone who's trying to transition from a temporary shared spaces permit to a permanent codified shared spaces permit will have their annual license fees waived. In the future, for all future applications that are fresh, not associated with those who are trying to transition from a temporary permit to a permanent permit, the full suite of fees will apply. But again, if you do make $2 million or less in San Francisco gross receipts for the I think it's 2 tax seasons ago, the data that we have on file for you, you will qualify for the half fee waiver. So that's just to say we know that economic recovery is going to be a long process. It's going to take longer than the actual pandemic. The pandemic might end, but our economic recovery will continue to roll forward, and so it'll be a long process. Just I think one more slide before I hand it over to Monica to talk about site feasibility. Another really important thing to know again is that between now and the end of the calendar year, December 31, 2021, you should expect to have your temporary permit that you have now, if you do have a temporary shared spaces permit, basically just extended. You'll get a renewal that'll change the date from an expiration of June 30th to an expiration date of December 2021. That's currently what the legislation provides for. In that time, between now and the end of the calendar year, we want folks to, of course, fix any of the issues they might have at their site that wouldn't qualify them for being compliant under code. And again, Monica, Gregory, and Nicole will talk about what some of those key code compliance issues and questions are. Those permit fees for those seeking to transition from a temporary to a permit program, again, will be collected in March 2022, that permit fee, but not the license fee. License fee will be waived. All right, so I've said enough, and I'm going to hand it over to Deputy Program Manager Monica Munowich at the MTA to talk about site feasibility and curb management.
Great, can you guys hear me okay? Yes, okay, awesome. Good afternoon, thank you so much for having me. Monica Munowich from the SFMTA Streets Division. So I'm going to be walking through a lot of what particularly MTA has spent a lot of time thinking about unique to this legislation and the codified program, balancing curbside functions, one of the few key core values that Robin mentioned briefly a few slides ago. This will be a very delicate and challenging situation for the city to be evaluating upcoming. I think as everyone has experienced, San Francisco is very dense, our right-of-way is already very constrained. Fortunately, a silver lining of the last year, because of shelter in place and our commercial corridors being less active as normal, it's enabled us to approve and say yes to shared spaces, that there's less competing demands. There has been over the state of the pandemic. As the city reopens and our streets get more lively and active, we're going to have to be really taking a holistic approach and ensuring that we're thinking about all needs of our commercial corridors within the lens of shared spaces. So sort of how do shared spaces fit within our already established core city values and goals? For example, around Vision Zero, we're a transit first city. The SFMJ has a curb management strategy that was adopted last February. So how does shared spaces fit within this framework? Next slide. So one space we've put a lot of energy and thought into this is in the curbside regulations. So this is for shared spaces. This would be an administrative document that really gets into the specifics of how we assess eligibility for curbside shared spaces. So where the code is explicit in the ordinance in some areas it defers to each agency's administrative procedure. So one example of that is the curbside that really kind of puts into practice and documents what we mean by Vision Zero, transit first, climate action, putting that into practice within and bringing shared spaces into that decision-making framework. So I won't go over these 11 in detail, but these are just example 11 of what's covered in detail within that document. So really being explicit and transparent around what happens if your shared space, if there's a bike share station there, or if there's a blue accessible loading zone, or if there's a bus zone. Where is it? Can there not be a shared space? Like blue zones is not an eligible shared space permit versus other. What are the considerations that we would take into account to cite certain conditions? So our document goes into these 11 and broader eligibility criteria in more detail. So public pivoting from balancing curbside functions, number 6 on our list is public access. Obviously, so much of what we loved about pre-COVID parklets were that they were available and open to the public at all times. How do we preserve this typology within this category of permits within the future codified program? So these 3 examples shown on the screen here illustrate the 3 different permit types, and that they each have different fees, and we'll go into that in a minute in more detail. But these visual illustrations demonstrate what we're talking about when we say public parklet. So that pre-COVID would be kind of that typology would be consolidated within this future program. You could still have a public parklet at a lower fee, and I'll talk about that again in a moment. Movable tables and chairs that can come in and out, in commercial, kind of most like what you see today during the pandemic, the structure that's there all the time. And then within this movable parklet, just a few notes. It's something that we have already seen many businesses take advantage of during the last 10 or so months, but something that we're really hoping to encourage more of us is a really flexible and creative way to if it works best for the business to be able to leverage the space when your business needs it, bring your materials in, and it goes back to whatever best curb use it was during normal times of day outside of your business operation. So this table just shows in a little bit more detail, compares with what those three that I was just talking about are. So the top and bottom row, the public parklet and commercial parklet, you'll see it kind of all the way on the right, on the right column. Those both have fixed structure, so they're sort of always there. The one is never available for commercial. The other one would be commercial for that business. That's the sponsor, versus the middle row, the movable parklets. Obviously are movable. They're not there all the time. They're only there during the hours of operation. And all of these would have a component of being publicly accessible. Even the commercial parklet would be required to have some amount of space in there available for public. So the fees, these are the current permit fees in the latest legislation. $1,000 for the parklet, $2,000 and all the way up to $3,000 for that commercial parklet. So these are the one-time fees for one space, and then there's that second column for a second or each additional parking space, what that fee looks like. And this wouldn't start until March 2022. And then the annual license fee, this sort of ongoing fee for 2023 moving forward, what that would be. And last slide, I believe, for me, is this neighborhood consent issue. So definitely something that we saw very complicated to navigate as we do our permit approvals out there today, of what if you want to expand? What if you're have a spot that your neighbor is not using? How do you sort of go about that permit approval process? So we will be continuing some form of this in the future. We would be requiring written consent for the ground floor tenant or the property manager or owner in absence of the ground floor tenant. So really important for the city to be able to sort of manage this really tricky kind of constrained space on our curbs to make sure it's equitable, fair, and transparent. And that's all for me. I think I'm kicking it over to Gregory. Is that right?
Hi, yes, this is Gregory Slocum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank all of our attendees for taking time out of their day to jump on here with us. Hopefully it wasn't too painful getting into the meeting. Miss seeing your body language as we go through this, because it helps us understand what we're missing, but thank you very much for your time today. My name is Gregory Slocum. I work with the Bureau of Street Use and Mapping over at Public Works, and we are the permitting body for shared spaces. And I work on the side of the house with the permit team, but I also work in tandem with our inspection and enforcement team. And those are the folks that are out in the field. So I'm going to talk briefly today about site design and general considerations, and just kind of run through a few slides on design and whatnot. As you can see, you know, we're seeking to inform, we're seeking to educate. We don't want these standards to be a mystery or riddle that you have to solve. We've translated materials into multiple languages, and Maria and her team, Maria Dialva from planning, they've done an excellent job of creating graphic demonstrations of standards. So that being said, I'm going to ask for the next slide and we'll jump into it. Site design, general considerations. So this isn't necessarily a formal spec, but this is something that we all have to keep in mind. The topography, the sidewalks, everything about San Francisco can vary from one block to another. And I'll be forthright in saying that some of the constraints may be demonstrated by the physical elements of your site. If you have a bus stop directly in front of it, if you're on a slope, there's going to be some inherent challenges that differ from site to site. So before one would even begin designing a site, I would start by looking at where you're starting, and if there are constraints on that site geographically or physically that are going to impact what you can do or how you can do it. So that being said, what we have here is a depiction like no problem here. This is a dream site. We can see there's a very nice wide sidewalk, at least 3 flags wide. We see that there's a nice flat parking spot. It's a little close to an intersection, which can sometimes have some sightline issues, but given how low to the ground the diverters are that are out, it doesn't look like they're presenting that. So this is a dream site, and more likely than not, this is not your site or my site or every site we look at, but it's a good way of kind of understanding the lay of the land and what could be utilized within that kind of ideal site. You see one thing that I'm going to point out, you see those red arrows, those kind of clearly demarcate a path of travel and clearance around vital elements of the site, like for instance, J, that fire hydrant, nothing's blocking it. There are a number of standards here that I'll speak to a little bit more as we go through, but that's what the purpose of this slide is. Next, please. This looks like we have some, it's labeled fire safety and emergency access, and that's going to kind of cover a few of these. But what we're looking at here is a depiction of drainage. What I mean is when you put something in the public right of way, how is water going to flow through or around it? During rainy season, are you going to be the business that started a pond on your block? Or are you going to just kind of go out there, be able to get a little grabber, take some debris from the gutter and call it a day? We've got some pretty good depictions of do's and don'ts that will allow for flow. This is something that we will be looking at when we do inspections. It's a top priority for the Public Utilities Commission and for other agencies, because as you can imagine, there's a trickle-down effect when it rains, and all of that rain trickles. It can impact other facilities, traffic safety, etc. And I like the next slide. Okay, 3-foot gap. This is a standard that we've employed, and this is very important for fire safety. The reason being is that when the fire truck pulls up adjacent to these structures, they need to be able to exit their truck and get into the building. In the course of designing a site, the 3-foot gap is a literal standard, and it's a true standard. But you can also kind of ask yourself categorically, and from a common sense point of view, how's fire going to get in here? Are they going to be able to see my address? Or if I gave them a description of the site, would they be able to see it from their vantage point? That's why the 3-foot gap's important, but also if you kind of understand what the intent is behind it, it may also lead you to a design that is more conducive for safety. Next slide, please. And then this is another one this is a tricky standard, sight lines. I know we've seen a lot of non-compliant structures where businesses essentially want to create an indoor dining experience outdoors. We understand why that's appealing. We understand the variability of the elements and how it can be less than hospitable for hospitality in some instances. But one thing that's imperative for safety is a visual connection from the street to the sidewalk. And as you can see, our firefighter, he can see right through that platform and identify, he or she can see that and identify where they need to enter. So that's the reason we have that. And I know it's a less than popular design standard because it's a restriction you have to work around, but it's imperative for health and safety. That's why it's in there. Next slide, please. Another element is just making sure that there's spacing from any heating element and something that's flammable, i.e. a canopy, an awning, etc. The heaters are subject to their own permitting process from San Francisco Fire. So that's worth knowing in advance that you cannot just kind of haul one on the sidewalk and put it out there. They're going to want to ensure that you have proper spacing and that it's a safe environment to do so. Propane storage is prohibited in the public right of way at this point in time. It's going to have to be off-site, or it's going to have to be outdoors on private property. I see we are into our next slide on sight lines and airflow. And this is a standard that we've been working through that allows air to go through and that also allows visibility. Permeable walls, it's going to be tricky because we're going to want to ensure that what's in one person's estimation, permeable is satisfactory from a compliance standard. Leaving it open is certainly the best and promotable practice. Next slide, please. And here's an example, this open back. This is a strong example in that airflow, visibility are all acceptable on all counts. Next slide, please. This is not a good example. If fire pulled up, they can't see it. It's limited airflow. It's getting too close to kind of an indoor facility outdoors. Department of Public Health has assisted our group with developing airflow standards. And the visibility standards are just kind of more common sense so that motorists and first responders can adequately see the site. Next slide, please. And this is, an extraordinarily bad example in that visibility and airflow are both obstructed. So we kind of have been going back and forth between good examples and bad examples. And if you're to look at these documents later, it can be a little overwhelming or confusing at first, but Maria did a great job of just throwing those X's on there. So look for the one that's all green lights, and that is a mimicable installation. Next, please. So this kind of harkens back to the earlier slide that I indicated, making sure that there are gutter clearances. As you can see, there's enough space here that if we had to get down on our hands and knees and push through debris, we can ensure that the flow of stormwater along the curb is adequate. This is a standard that we brought over from the old parklet program. This is not anything new or revelatory to that extent. Next slide, please. And this is a bad example. As you can see, they put the base flush along the curb, and well, it doesn't look like this is immediately after a storm. We can see that there's already debris accumulating there, and as such, it will not be conducive to stormwater flow. Next slide, please. ADA requirements, very, 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 very important. This is probably, amongst our paramount concerns, not that any of these requirements are, they're all important, but we can see that there's a continuous path of travel throughout here and an unobstructed sidewalk. It's not a game of hopscotch to get through. There are diverters proximate to the seating so that if I have a visual impairment, I'm aware of impending seating in front of me, and it's very nice and clear to that extent. This is going to be one of the biggest challenges that participants in our program face with accessibility, because I'll be forthright. Oftentimes we see folks that are trying to stuff, 5 pounds into a 3-pound sack, and that extra 2 pounds typically inhibits movement and it typically runs afoul of ADA standards. So from that perspective, you may want to look at your site as an overall envelope, and then kind of build in. Build in from clearances, make sure that there's accessibility around, build in, and that your gutter, you're spacing out so that there's flow throughout it. So that's one way to look at it, as opposed to looking in and building out. Next slide, please.
Greg, I'm happy.
I'm going to pass it to, before we advance, just pass it on to Director Bond, I think, who is going to maybe talk through some of the specifics of ADA.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gregory. That was a very thorough introduction to our guide requirements. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Again, I'm Nicole Bond. I'm the Director of the Mayor's Office on Disability. And what our office does is help to oversee accessibility compliance, and we're also a place where people with disabilities can come to learn about requirements, and also file complaints and concerns. And so really our discussion today is geared towards how can we really help you as a business owner provide an accessible environment that everyone can enjoy. And I'll say a couple of things just to give you some context. In San Francisco, we have over 94,000 residents with disabilities, and also another third of that is older adults who are using some kind of mobility device or have some sort of disability that really impacts the way that folks move through the world. So our design guidelines specific to ADA requirements are really designed to help, again, so that everyone can participate safely and comfortably, and also enjoy businesses. And I'll say also that we know very clearly from the disability community that they're very interested and enthusiastic about helping work together with business community members to make sure we're creating a great environment for everyone. So Greg already touched to some of the basic requirements. So we'll move on now to another example. This is a very rudimentary example of some basic ADA guidelines, and our colleagues in the Department of Public Works are working on developing even more specific parklet guidelines related to ADA. But what is illustrated here are some examples of providing an accessible entry for someone who is a wheelchair user, the appropriate amount of turnaround space, accessible table seating, companion seating. Those are just a few of the requirements that are necessary in order to provide a space that everyone can enjoy. Next slide, please. And so these next few slides, and then we'll be getting to your questions very soon, are again meant to help folks understand what are some good examples and what are some not as good examples on how we can maintain accessibility and what we call an accessible path of travel in our sidewalk. And so what this slide shows is we have less than 6 feet of clear path of travel, clear unobstructed path of travel, which assists people with mobility devices and also folks who are blind or low vision, in particular, navigate our sidewalks. Next slide, please. This is another example where we have less than 6 feet, and also a pole in our way there. So we don't have an unobstructed, clear path of travel, and we don't have quite enough square footage to pass through safely. Next slide, please. This is a good example of a demonstration of the use of a curb lane. Here we have a flush to the sidewalk, our parklet, which is great because then you can roll right in there. If you do not have that capability, we do need to be able to have ramped areas to our parklets that are also accessible. Next slide, please. And so this is a mixture of a little bit of good and a little bit of not as good. So we do have the 6 feet path of travel here, but we don't have diverter markations at the beginning and end of the table seating. And what those diverters are they're kind of like standing platforms that help someone who is blind or low vision identify when they're exiting one kind of area and entering another kind of area, so that they don't cane into chairs or an overhang or in some other way cause injury to themselves. And this is one of our federal requirements that we've had in place for quite some time. So those are just a few of the requirements that we have. There are many more that we're working towards developing in even more specificity that are easy to follow. And so with that, I will hand it back over to Robin and Maria to help facilitate our question and answers.
Thank you, Director Bond. And thanks again to the team. We're going to hand it over to Maria de Alva, who I think has been collecting questions from you all. Again, myself, Monica Munowich, Gregory Slocum, Director Nicole Bond, and Amanda Freed from the Treasurer Tax Collector's Office is here to answer any questions about what we've just seen. So, hand the mic over to Maria.
Thank you, Robin. So the first question, we only have a couple of comments here so far, so please feel free to continue to post your questions in the chat, direct them towards me. And the first question, and I think Monica is the best person to answer. The first question is from Yuka. What is the guideline on how many parking spots were allocated to each business? And we've seen restaurants allowed 4, or the ones on the corner are allowed both sides, and some even had a bus stop moved.
That's right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So yes, so there will be, I should know this off the top of my head, caps to address that very issue. It's been a lot of businesses, depending on the location, right, may just have 4 or 5. And so I believe the legislation has 2, maybe Robin, correct me if I'm wrong. I can look at this while I'm chatting through, but 1, 2, no problem. There's obviously that fee and the fee component that the first space has a certain fee and then per additional space. But yeah, to address that very issue, we are looking at caps. The bus zone question, though, that shared spaces are not allowed in active bus zones. We do make conditions to allow a shared space in a bus zone if it's not currently in service, because unfortunately, as we all know, there's been a lot of reduction in muni service over the last year. So more are opening up. So in the codified future program, we would similarly review every situation is different. We may be able to allow temporarily while if a bus zone is not being used, but then the permit, the sponsor would be kind of taking that at risk. They wouldn't be responsible for that, whatever that duration is, to remove ultimately or relocate if they're in a bus zone that ends up being active.
Thank you, Monica. And I'll move on to the next question coming from Ian. And I'll paraphrase a little bit. This is a question about, or more of a comment and concern about the amount of noise pollution caused by several of the shared spaces, and just allowing bars and restaurants to have amplified sound. Just a concern, especially about busy commercial corridors where there's residents living above these establishments and in other proximate areas. And also, obviously we're all sheltering from home, so it makes it harder to work from home. And then also, just the jam permit, just add music permit, which he mentions that there's no awareness of which communities are being impacted by these permits, and some of them are not regulated. So just a concern to please try to modify that legislation so that it doesn't allow unregulated noise.
Thank you, Ian, for bringing this up. I might just offer a couple things. One is, if anyone's ever experiencing a nuisance, whether they think it's for a permitted amplified sound or whether they think it's from amplified sound that is not permitted, it really helps us as a city follow up on that if you report it to 311 every time that you experience it. It might seem like overkill, but that really helps us build a body of record and understand where there are hotspots and who we need to work with in order to make sure that everybody in the neighborhood is having a good quality of life. So I don't want to minimize the issue because it is very real for some folks, but please make use of that 311 app. That goes also for any issues that you might see potentially around accessibility or ADA, whether you're a disabled person or not. If you see something that you think isn't right, please let us know. Again, that when you submit a 311 ticket or notice, that triggers action that the city has to take to follow up and investigate. So it's really, really important. We don't want to rely solely on 311 as the only way of doing enforcement, but it's a big part of helping us help you. Also, again, with jam permits and amplified sound, there are very clear decibel limits when amplified sound permits are given. Also, operating hours are regulated. So, if somebody is operating within the bounds of their jam permit, there shouldn't be any problem. But again, 311 and other ways of letting us know can help us work with the active party to reshape what it is that they're doing to minimize and eliminate neighborhood livability conflicts. So
Thank you, Robin. We have one more question from Greg. There is a red zone for right turn only in front of my business. However, the street that the lane turns into is a shared space street and is closed weekdays, evenings, and all day weekends, which essentially renders the right turn lane useless. How can I have the city remove the red zone?
And that was from Greg, probably for Monica, I'm guessing.
Probably for Monica.
Oh, so sorry. I was waiting for Greg for that one.
Sorry.
It's okay. I was trying to see in my mind if I could picture that exact use. I'm not sure if that red zone is a daylighting zone, so that the visibility in front of an intersection. It sounds like it may or may not be, but
Seems like it's a right turn. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I'll finish describing. So right. Sometimes at the beginning of an intersection, the red, the curb is marked for, it's called daylighting to provide visibility. And that is something that would be in those instances that red zone would be kept clear. And shared spaces couldn't go right up until the intersection because of visibility concerns. For a right turn lane, I'm guessing it's still, even if the street is closed, it's not closed all the time, but there's time of day that there's still a need for a right turn. I'm a very visual person, so maybe I'm not picturing this right, but I don't know that the city could remove it unless it was never, I get the situation that doesn't perhaps have the same need if there's street closures and other things, but I don't know if that street closure is all the time or if it is a shared space one that's going to continue. I guess it depends. I'm happy to answer it more offline if that answer wasn't sufficient.
Thank you,
I was
Monica.
gonna say, go ahead, Maria.
I was just gonna put in the chat the email where you can email us and ask us any specific questions. Obviously, this one needs staff to do some further review, so I'll put that in the chat for everyone to have. And yeah, in the meantime, I'll continue with the questions. We have one more question from Lee. Looks like she has a situation where there's street parking on her frontage, but it's between two restaurants. So she's asking which restaurant has the right to use it, which can be tricky. And maybe this is both for Monica and Greg, but also the whole team. Yes.
It's hard to say without knowing the situation, but if it's just a general parking space, I don't know that either business has sort of the right to it. So maybe I'm not understanding the question, but if it's just sort of you're talking about a general metered or even unmetered space, and there's a business on either side with a shared space, it's still, regardless of shared space there or not, it's general parking. I don't know if it was like a space that was like previously like a loading zone that was for a specific business, and that would have a clear who that kind of, yeah, I don't know that it belongs to anybody.
Thank you, Monica.
I mean, this is Gregory, and I would also assert that it belongs to the public right-of-way, these spots. It's all public right-of-way. Our job is to assist with the occupancy and utilization but it has to fall within the considerations of the program. It has to be an appropriate site. It's very challenging. Folks are working through a lot of through their existence right now, small businesses, and we understand like how challenging that is. That every square foot can be receipts, but there are no like outright entitlements. All of these are subject to review and consideration by appropriate agencies, and that's probably like a better way to look at it is does this meet the guidelines? And if you can go through those guidelines, it's looking better. But ultimately, it's at the discretion of the agencies that have to review this. We're trying to put out material so that it's not a guessing game and that you understand what those expectations are. We'll seek to do more sessions like this to enhance understanding, but no one, I mean, like my mom couldn't do it, just look out their storefront and go, that's mine, and I'm gonna put this there. We have to go through all of our review and process, and hopefully our team can work together to make that like a less than painful experience for participants and something that is predictable and accessible. That is all.
Thank you, Greg. And this is all the questions we have so far. If you have any additional question, please put them in the chat. I don't know if Nick has any additional questions in the queue there. Oh, it looks like Ian has a question.
Let's do one more and then maybe we can wrap up with next steps.
I wonder if, let me see. Oh, it's the same question about the noise. Was there a specific question that we weren't able to answer, Ian? Please leave it in the chat, and if not, we can get back to you via email. Okay, so it looks like he missed the reply, but just to summarize what you said, Robin, please, anytime you're experiencing a nuisance, please report it to 311. And that doesn't mean that your complaint will have to take every time, but please every time just report it to 311. And then also that operating hours are regulated for jam permits. So if you think they're operating outside of those bounds, please report as well. And otherwise they should be complying with those. And that's it from me. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'll kick it back to you, Robin or Nick.
Thank you, Maria, for moderating. So I think, again, if you have any questions about the content we talked about today or in the future, please email us at sharedspaces@sfgov.org. I'll also put in the chat a link to a webpage where you can find more information on the legislation itself, as well as information for future hearings and other public presentations like this one, so that you can stay up to date on the progress of transitioning this temporary emergency response program into a permanent opportunity for San Francisco small businesses. Before we go, I do want to thank the folks again at the Joint Information Center, Nick Marino, Alyssa Carawala, Marianne Thompson, Dylan Smith at OEWD, and the rest of the big team that puts on these webinars. They do such a stand-up job at curating and as well as running them. So thank you folks there. And then also another big thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for organizing this week and sponsoring that. So from myself, Monica Munowich, Gregory Slocum, Maria de Alva, Nicole Bon, and Amanda Freed, thank you for your time, and please reach out to us via email if there's anything else you think we can help you with.
Thank you all for joining us today. For any upcoming events, please visit SF Small Business